Boys digging his own grave. Harlan Whitmore laughed loud enough for everyone at the general store to hear. 8 months later, that same Harlan Whitmore would carry his unconscious daughter through waist-deep snow, pound on Stellan Vargar's door at 2 in the morning, and beg the fool to save what was left of his family. But that January night was still far away when Stellan Vargar first arrived in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory. The spring of 1878 brought him to those wide grasslands with almost nothing to his name. One wagon, 2 aging horses, a crate of tools wrapped in oilcloth, a gray dog with eyes like winter fog, and a memory that would not let him rest. He was 33 years old, tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of years carrying weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. His face rarely showed expression, his mouth rarely opened to speak, but his hands never stopped moving, never stopped working, as if stillness itself was something he could not afford. The land office in Corvallis had given him 160 acres on the northern edge of the valley. Good land, they said, flat enough for farming, close enough to water, far enough from the mountains to avoid the worst of the avalanche country. Stellan had nodded and signed the papers without asking questions. He did not care about farming. He did not care about water rights or proximity to town. He cared about one thing only, and that was the depth of the frost line and the direction of the prevailing winter wind. The clerk had looked at him strangely when he asked about those things. Nobody asked about frost lines in April. Nobody thought about winter wind when the sun was warm and the grass was turning green. But Stellan thought about winter constantly. He thought about it the way some men thought about gold or women or God. Winter lived inside him like a second heartbeat, cold and patient and always waiting. He drove his wagon to the claim on a Tuesday morning when the sky was pale blue and cloudless. The Bitterroot Mountains rose to the west, still capped with snow that would not melt until June. The valley floor stretched before him like an ocean of grass, rolling gently toward horizons that seemed impossibly far away. Most men who came to this country looked at that land and saw opportunity. They saw crops waiting to be planted. They saw cattle waiting to graze. They saw a future built on hard work and good fortune. Stellan looked at that land and saw something else entirely. He saw how flat it was, how exposed. He saw how the wind would come screaming down from the north with nothing to stop it for hundreds of miles. He saw how the snow would pile and drift and bury anything that stood in its path. He saw how a house built quickly and poorly would become a coffin when the temperature dropped and the blizzards came. He saw all of this because he had seen it before, 8 years ago, in a small village called Røros, nestled in the mountains of Norway, where his father and his sister had died in a single night because a house built too quickly had become a tomb of ice and broken timber. The dog jumped down from the wagon and stood beside him, ears pricked forward, nose testing the wind. His name was Odin, and he had belonged to Stellan's sister Astrid before she died. The dog was 4 years old now, still strong and alert, but already showing the calm steadiness of a creature who had witnessed loss and learned to carry it quietly. Stellan reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head. Odin pressed against his leg, and for a moment neither of them moved. They simply stood there on that empty prairie, looking at land that held no memories yet, land that knew nothing of what had happened in Norway or why Stellan Vargar had traveled 5,000 miles to stand in this particular place. Then Stellan picked up a shovel and began to dig. Not a small hole, not a shallow trench for a foundation that would rise quickly and collapse just as quickly when the ground shifted beneath it. Stellan began excavating a pit that measured 40 feet long, 25 feet wide, and nearly 10 feet deep. 10 feet into the hard Montana earth, down past the frost line, down to where the ground stayed the same temperature year-round, regardless of what happened in the sky above. He worked alone that first day, and the second day, and the third. The horses grazed nearby while he dug. Odin lay in the grass and watched, occasionally rising to chase away a rabbit or bark at a distant coyote. The wagon sat untouched, its contents still wrapped and waiting. By the fourth day, the news had spread. A man digging a hole big enough to bury his own cabin. The first visitor arrived on horseback that same afternoon. Harlan Whitmore was 52 years old, the largest landowner in the valley, a former cavalry officer who had fought in the war between the states and never let anyone forget it. He rode a black gelding that cost more than most homesteads. and he wore his confidence like a uniform that had never been taken off. His wife Dorothea waited on the wagon road behind him, a woman of 48 who had followed her husband from Ohio to Montana without complaint, but also without enthusiasm. She watched the Norwegian work with an expression that held more curiosity than contempt, though she would never contradict her husband in public. Harlan stopped at the edge of the pit and looked down at Stellan, who was chest-deep in dirt and still digging. For a long moment, Whitmore said nothing. He simply watched the shovel rise and fall, with a rhythm that never varied. Then he laughed. It was not a quiet laugh. It was the kind of laugh that was meant to be heard, meant to be shared, meant to establish exactly where everyone stood in the hierarchy of the valley. Boy's digging his own grave before the prairie kills him. Stellan stopped digging. He looked up at the man on the horse, his face expressionless, his gray eyes revealing nothing. "House," he said. His English was accented, the words shaped by a tongue that had grown up speaking Norwegian. "Foundation for house." Whitmore laughed again. "That hole could swallow a barn. What kind of house needs a foundation 10 feet deep?" "Strong house," Stellan said. "House that stands." "Every house stands," Whitmore replied, "until it falls down. And yours will fall faster than most. Built by a man who doesn't know the first thing about this country." Stellan did not argue. He did not explain. He simply looked at Harlan Whitmore for a long moment, his face as unreadable as stone. And then he said 3 words that Whitmore would remember for the rest of his life. "You will see." Then he went back to digging. Whitmore rode away still laughing, and by nightfall everyone in Corvallis had heard the story. The crazy Norwegian was digging a hole in the ground big enough to bury himself, his wagon, his horses, and probably his dog too. He had not planted crops. He had not built shelter. He had simply started digging like a man possessed by demons. The bets started that same night at the saloon. $20 said the hole would fill with water by June. $50 said the Norwegian would give up and leave before summer ended. $100 said he would be dead before the first snow fell. Nobody bet that he would survive. If you have ever started something that everyone around you said was foolish, if you have ever kept working while the whole world laughed, I would like to hear your story. Leave a comment and tell me about a time when you knew something that nobody else believed. The pit grew deeper through April and into May. The soil changed as Stellan dug downward. The first 3 feet were rich prairie loam, dark and fertile, easy to cut with a shovel. Below that came harder clay, yellowish-brown and dense, requiring more effort to break apart. Below the clay lay limestone fragments mixed with gravel, and then solid limestone bedrock that had to be chipped away piece by piece. Stellan's hands blistered during the first week. The blisters broke and bled, and then they healed and hardened into calluses that could grip a shovel handle for 16 hours without pain. His shoulders ached constantly. His back screamed at him every morning when he woke. But he never slowed, and he never stopped. More visitors came as the weeks passed. Luther Crenshaw arrived in early May. He was 45 years old, a carpenter by trade, the man who had built half the cabins in the valley. He considered himself an expert on construction, and he had come to offer professional judgment on the Norwegian's madness. He climbed down into the pit and examined the walls, running his hands along the squared edges, studying the precision of the cuts. Despite himself, he was impressed by the craftsmanship. The corners were perfectly square. The walls were perfectly plumb. Whatever else the Norwegian might be, he was not careless. But expertise often blinds a man to possibilities he has not considered. "No foundation needs to go this deep," Crenshaw announced when he climbed back out. "It's engineering nonsense. You're wasting time that should be spent on the house itself." Stellan continued working without looking up. "The house will come." "When? Next year? The year after?" Crenshaw shook his head. "You'll freeze this winter in a hole in the ground, if you even last that long." "I have seen houses built fast," Stellan said quietly. "I have seen what happens to them." "And what's that?" Stellan stopped digging. He looked at Crenshaw with eyes that held something the carpenter could not identify. Pain, perhaps, or memory, or simply a knowledge too heavy to carry into words. "They become graves," Stellan said. Then he went back to digging. And Crenshaw rode away to tell everyone that the Norwegian was not just foolish, but morbid as well. Reverend Josiah Tate came 3 days later. He was 58 years old, the Methodist minister for Corvallis and the surrounding valley, a man who believed he understood the ways of God better than most and was not shy about sharing that understanding with others. He stood at the edge of the pit with his hands clasped behind his back and watched Stellan work for several minutes before speaking. "Perhaps the Lord humbles the proud through their own foolishness, Mr. Varger." Stellan did not stop digging. "I am not proud. No, a man who ignores the advice of everyone around him? A man who insists on his own way, despite all evidence to the contrary? That sounds like pride to me." "I do not ignore advice," Stellan said. "I listen. Then I do what I know is right." "And how do you know it's right?" Stellan paused. He looked up at the minister, and for just a moment, something flickered in his gray eyes. Not anger, not defiance. Something older and sadder than either. "Because I have seen what wrong looks like," he said. "I have held it in my arms while it stopped breathing." The minister had no response to that. He stood in silence for a long moment, then turned and walked away without offering a blessing or a farewell. The last skeptic to make his opinion known was Ephraim Kessler, a 67-year-old banker and land speculator who had made his fortune buying failed homesteads for pennies on the dollar. He rode out to Stellan's claim in a buggy that cost more than most families earned in 2 years, and he studied the rising structure with eyes that calculated value the way other men calculated distance. "That land will be mine by spring when he fails," Kessler told Luther Crenshaw at the general store that evening. "The Norwegian doesn't understand that this country breaks dreamers. I've seen it 100 times. They build too big, plant too little, and by March they're selling everything they own just to afford passage back east." He smiled, and the smile held no warmth at all. "I've already drafted the purchase offer. All I have to do is wait." But one visitor did not come to laugh or lecture. Old Ezekiel Thorne arrived on a June morning when the pit was nearly complete. He was 78 years old, the first white settler in the Bitterroot Valley, a man who had seen more winters than anyone else alive in that country. He walked with a cane carved from elk antler, and his face was a map of wrinkles that told stories he rarely shared. He stood at the edge of the pit and looked down for a long time. He studied the squared walls. He noted the drainage channels Stellan had cut into the floor. He observed the angle at which the pit faced south, catching the maximum winter sun while sheltering from the north wind. Then he climbed down carefully, using his cane for balance, and stood beside Stellan in the bottom of the excavation. "I remember the winter of '56, he said quietly. "Coldest I ever saw, 40 below for 3 weeks straight. Most of the cabins in this valley collapsed. The ones that survived were the ones with cellars. Deep cellars. Round cellars." Stellan stopped digging and looked at the old man. "Round things last," Ezekiel continued. "Square things break. That's what my grandfather used to say. He built houses in Vermont, back before anyone came this far west. He knew things that people have forgotten." "My mother said the same," Stellan replied. "In Norway, she said the earth will protect you if you ask it properly." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "Your mother sounds like she had good sense." "She did. She died 3 years ago, but she taught me first." The old man reached out and placed a gnarled hand on Stellan's shoulder. It was the first friendly touch Stellan had received since arriving in Montana. "They'll laugh at you until the snow falls," Ezekiel said, "and then they'll stop laughing. I've seen it before. The smart ones learn, the stupid ones die. That's how winter works." He climbed out of the pit slowly, pausing at the top to catch his breath. "Build deep," he said. "Build strong, and don't let the bastards get to you." Then he walked away, leaving Stellan alone with his dog and his shovel and the beginning of something nobody else understood. By late June, the pit was finished. 40 feet long, 25 feet wide, 10 feet deep. The walls were squared and smooth. The floor was graded with a slight slope toward one corner, where a drainage basin had been carved into the bedrock. Channels radiated across the floor like the spokes of a wheel, all leading to that central basin. Now Stellan began the second phase of his work. He hauled stone. A limestone outcrop lay 9 miles to the west, at the base of the Bitterroot Mountains. Every morning before dawn, Stellan hitched his horses to the wagon and drove those 9 miles through the darkness. He worked through the morning, chipping blocks of limestone from the rock face, loading them onto the wagon until the axles groaned under the weight. Then he drove the 9 miles back, unloaded the stone beside the pit, and went to sleep for a few hours before starting again. Each trip carried approximately 1,200 pounds of stone. The horses struggled under the weight. The wagon wheels cut deep ruts into the prairie. Stellan's arms and back screamed with exhaustion. But he did not stop. Day after day, week after week, the stone pile grew. By mid-July, he had hauled more than 25 tons of limestone to his claim. The pile rose beside the pit like a monument to stubbornness, and the neighbors who passed along the wagon trail stopped to stare. Luther Crenshaw returned with his wife Margaret, a 42-year-old woman who knew everyone's business and made sure everyone knew that she knew. She stood beside her husband and looked at the stone pile with something between amusement and pity. "Poor immigrant doesn't know any better," she said loudly enough for Stellan to hear. "Someone should tell him that he's wasting his life." "I've tried," Luther replied. "He doesn't listen." "Men never do," Margaret said, "especially the stubborn ones. They have to learn everything the hard way." Stellan did not respond. He continued stacking stone in the bottom of the pit, laying each block with precision, checking the level constantly, building walls that would stand for 100 years if they stood for a day. But there was one person who came not to mock or pity. Her name was Linnea Whitmore, and she was 19 years old, the eldest daughter of Harlan Whitmore, the man who had laughed loudest and longest at Stellan's foolishness. She had her father's dark hair, but not his arrogance, her mother's gentle eyes, but not her willingness to follow where her husband led. She came on a July afternoon when Stellan was working alone in the pit, setting stone in the summer heat. She carried a basket covered with a cloth, and she walked with the cautious determination of someone who knew she should not be there, but had decided to come anyway. Odin saw her first. The young dog rose from his spot in the shade and trotted toward her, tail wagging slowly. She knelt down and scratched behind his ears, and he leaned into her touch with obvious pleasure. "Your dog is friendlier than you are," she said when Stellan finally looked up. He wiped sweat from his face with a dirty forearm. "Odin likes everyone. I am more selective." "I brought food." She held up the basket. "Bread and cheese and some dried apples. My mother's cook made them this morning." Stellan studied her for a long moment. He was not used to kindness from the people of this valley. He was not sure how to respond to it. "Why?" he finally asked. "Because you work hard and you work alone, and my father is wrong about you." She set the basket down at the edge of the pit. "He's wrong about a lot of things, but he never admits it. Your father hates me. My father doesn't hate you. He just doesn't understand you. There's a difference." She sat down on the grass, her skirts spreading around her like flower petals. "I've been watching you work, every day from the hill over there. You never stop. You never rest. You just keep going, hour after hour, like something is chasing you." Stellan was silent for a moment. Then he climbed out of the pit and sat down a few feet away from her, close enough to talk, but far enough to maintain propriety. Odin settled between them, his muzzle resting on his paws. "Something is chasing me," Stellan said quietly. "Memory." "Memory of what?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes looked past her, past the valley, past the mountains, towards something she could not see. "I had a sister once," he said. "Her name was Astrid. She was 14 years old. She had hair the color of wheat and a laugh that could fill any room she entered." Linnea waited, sensing that there was more. "We lived in a village called Røros in Norway, high in the mountains, where winter comes early and stays late. My father built houses. He was a good builder, but he was also impatient. He wanted to finish quickly, to move on to the next project, to earn more money for the family." Stellan's voice was steady, but his hands had begun to shake slightly. "When I was 25 years old, a storm came. The worst storm anyone had ever seen. Snow fell for 4 days without stopping. The wind was so strong it knocked grown men off their feet. And the cold," he paused. "The cold was like nothing I can describe. It reached into your chest and squeezed your heart until you could not breathe." "What happened?" Linnea asked softly. "Our house collapsed. The foundation was only 2 feet deep, built on frozen ground that moved when the frost pushed upward. The walls cracked first, then the roof fell. My father was holding up a beam, trying to keep the ceiling from coming down on us, when the whole structure gave way. Stellan's eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, they were wet. He died instantly. The beam crushed him. My mother and I survived because we were near the door, but Astrid, his voice broke slightly. Astrid was trapped under the rubble. She was still alive when I reached her, still conscious, still trying to smile at me because she did not want me to be afraid. Linnea's hand moved toward him without her conscious will, but she stopped herself before touching him. She understood instinctively that this was not a moment for physical comfort. This was a moment for witness. I held her for 3 hours, Stellan continued. The storm was too strong to dig her out. The neighbors could not reach us. All I could do was hold her hand and talk to her, and watch her grow weaker with every breath. He looked at Linnea directly. She died in my arms as the sun was rising. She was 14 years old, and the last thing she said to me was that she was sorry. Sorry for what? For dying, for leaving me alone. Stellan shook his head slowly. She apologized for dying, as if it were her fault, as if she had done something wrong by being crushed by a house that should have protected her. Silence stretched between them. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily in the summer sky. That is why I dig deep, Stellan said finally. That is why I build strong. Because I promised her, in those last hours, that I would never let the earth take another person I love. I would never build a house that could become a grave. Linnea looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. My father thinks he knows everything, she said, but he's never lost anyone. He doesn't understand that some knowledge only comes through pain. Stellan looked at her hand on his arm, at her face soft with compassion, and something shifted in his chest. Not warmth exactly, but the first hint that warmth might someday be possible again. Thank you for the food, he said. She smiled. There will be more tomorrow, and the day after that, until you learn to accept kindness without asking why. She rose gracefully and walked away across the grass, and Odin watched her go with his tail wagging slowly. When she was out of sight, the young dog turned and looked at his master with knowing eyes. I know, Stellan said softly. I know. Then he climbed back into the pit and continued building walls that would outlast every doubt, every mockery, every fear. If you have ever lost someone who meant everything to you, if you carry them with you in everything you do, I would like to hear about them. Tell me in the comments who you carry in your heart. By August, the foundation walls were complete. They rose 3 feet above the prairie grass and descended 10 feet below, massive and solid, built from limestone blocks that weighed hundreds of pounds each. The walls were 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they rose, angled to deflect wind rather than resist it directly. Drainage channels ran along the outside base, carrying groundwater away from the foundation. Inside, the floor was sealed with clay mixed with lime, creating a surface that would not absorb moisture or crack with temperature changes. From a distance, the structure looked like a buried fortress, like something that belonged to a different age, a different country, a different way of thinking about what it meant to build. The neighbors could not stop talking about it. Colton Briggs was 24 years old, the younger son of a rancher who had died 2 years earlier, leaving his widow and children to struggle with a spread they could barely manage. He had energy without direction, opinions without wisdom, and a mouth that worked faster than his brain. He rode out to Stellan's claim on an August afternoon with 2 friends his own age, all of them slightly drunk and looking for entertainment. $20 says that hole fills with water before the first snow, he announced loudly. Another 20 says the whole thing collapses by Christmas. Stellan was fitting a timber beam into place, the first of the massive posts that would support the structure above ground. He did not look up. I'll put $50 on the Norwegian being dead by spring, one of Colton's friends added, frozen solid in his little cave. The young men laughed and drank from a flask they were passing between them. They made jokes about graves and coffins and Norwegian stupidity. They compared Stellan's foundation to various forms of livestock accommodation. Through it all, Stellan worked in silence. He fitted the beam. He checked its position. He adjusted it slightly. Then he began securing it to the foundation with iron brackets that Klaus Brenner had forged for him in secret. Klaus Brenner was 44 years old, a German immigrant who had come to Montana 15 years earlier and built a reputation as the best blacksmith in the territory. He was a quiet man like Stellan, and he recognized in the Norwegian a kinship that went beyond nationality. They were both builders, both craftsmen, both men who understood that some things were more important than speed or profit. He had visited Stellan's claim one evening after the foundation was complete, walking the perimeter of the structure slowly, examining every detail. He did not speak for nearly an hour. He simply looked and thought and remembered things his own grandfather had taught him in Bavaria, where men built houses to survive winters that could kill entire villages. "My grandfather built like this," Klaus finally said. They laughed at him too, called him a slow fool who wasted time on things that did not matter. "What happened to his houses?" Stellan asked. "They are still standing, 100 years later. The houses of the men who laughed are gone, burned or collapsed or torn down and replaced." Klaus smiled slightly. Time is the only judge that matters. He had begun forging the brackets that same night, working after hours when the other customers had gone home. He charged Stellan nothing for the labor. The iron itself was paid for with 2 days of work splitting firewood for Klaus's winter supply. Now those brackets held the first beam in place, and Stellan moved to the second and the third and the fourth. Colton Briggs and his friends eventually grew bored with mocking a man who would not respond. They rode away as the sun was setting, their laughter fading into the distance like the last echoes of a storm that had passed without causing damage. Odin watched them go, with his ears flat against his head. He did not trust young men who laughed too loudly. "I know," Stellan said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "But they are not worth your anger. Save it for something that matters." Odin relaxed slightly, and together they watched the sunset paint the Bitterroot Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The walls rose through August and into September. They were not ordinary walls. Nothing about Stellan's construction was ordinary. The outer layer was built from Douglas fir beams, 8 inches thick, cut from trees that Stellan had felled himself in the forests at the base of the mountains. He had spent 2 weeks logging, working from dawn until dusk, selecting only trees with straight grain and no visible defects. The wood had been stripped of bark and allowed to dry for 3 weeks before being fitted into place. Inside that outer layer was a gap of 16 inches. Into this gap, Stellan packed a mixture of clay, straw, and dried grass, compressed until it formed a solid mass that would trap air and prevent heat from escaping. The inner layer was another 6 inches of Douglas fir, sealed with a mixture of pine pitch and beeswax to prevent moisture penetration. Total wall thickness, 30 inches, more than twice what any other house in the valley possessed. Luther Crenshaw came to watch again, bringing a measuring stick and a critical eye. He walked around the structure slowly, checking dimensions, testing the solidity of the construction. Despite his earlier skepticism, he was impressed by the craftsmanship. The corners were perfectly square. The walls were perfectly plumb. Every joint was tight enough to prevent drafts, but expertise often becomes a prison. "These walls are too thick," he announced. "You're trapping weight in the middle where it has no structural purpose. The house will be cold in winter because you cannot heat that much mass efficiently." Stellan continued working without responding. "The clay will absorb moisture and freeze," Luther continued. "When it freezes, it will expand. When it expands, your walls will crack. By spring, you'll have gaps you can put your fist through." Stellan fitted another beam into place. "Are you even listening to me?" "Yes," Stellan said. "I am listening. You are wrong, but I am listening." Luther's face reddened. "I have been building houses for 20 years. I know what works in this country." "You know what fails slowly," Stellan replied. "I am building something that does not fail at all." "That's arrogance." "No," Stellan looked at him directly. "That is memory. I have seen houses built the way you build them. I have seen what happens when winter comes and the cold has no mercy. I will not build that way. I cannot." Luther stared at him for a long moment, his expression caught somewhere between anger and confusion. Then he shook his head and walked away, muttering about stubborn immigrants who refused to learn from those who knew better. Margaret Crenshaw heard the story that evening and spread it through the valley within 2 days. The Norwegian was not just foolish, he was arrogant. He thought he knew better than men who had been building on this land for decades. He had insulted her husband's expertise. He had called him wrong to his face. The mockery intensified. The bets increased, and Stellan kept building. The roof was the final challenge. Most settlers built roofs quickly. Thin boards covered with tar paper, a layer of sod on top, enough to keep rain out during summer. These roofs sagged under snow. They leaked during spring melt. They rotted from the inside out and had to be replaced every few years. Stellan built something entirely different. Heavy cross beams ran from wall to wall, each one nearly 18 inches in diameter. These beams rested on the vertical posts that descended through the walls and connected directly to the stone foundation below. The weight of the roof did not rest on the walls. It rested on the posts, which transferred the load directly to the bedrock. Above the cross beams, Stellan laid thick planks. Above the planks, a layer of clay sealed with pine pitch. Above the clay, sod cut from the prairie in thick squares, laid root side up so the grass would grow and bind the sections together. Total roof thickness, 24 inches. Total weight, more than 20 tons. Harlan Whitmore came to watch the final sod being lifted into place. He sat on his black gelding at the edge of the property, his face unreadable, his silence more disturbing than his laughter had been. "That roof will crush your walls," he finally said. "You've built a house designed to destroy itself?" Stellan climbed down from the roof and faced the rancher. He was covered in dirt and sweat, his clothes stained with clay, his hands black with pitch, but his eyes were steady. "The walls do not carry the roof," he said. "The posts carry the roof. The posts rest on the foundation. The foundation rests on the bedrock. The weight goes down, not out." Whitmore studied the structure for a long moment. Despite himself, he was beginning to wonder if he had misjudged the Norwegian. The construction was unlike anything he had seen before, but it possessed a logic that was difficult to dismiss. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why build like this? Nobody else does." "Because nobody else has watched a house fall on the people they love," Stellan replied. "Nobody else has held their sister while she died because the walls were too thin and the foundation was too shallow. Nobody else carries that weight." He pointed at the roof. "That weight is nothing compared to what I carry, and I will carry it until the day I die if it means no one else has to bury their family in the rubble of a house that should have protected them." Whitmore had no response. He sat in silence for a moment, then turned his horse and rode away without another word. For the first time since Stellan had arrived in the valley, Harlan Whitmore was not laughing. By mid-October, the house was complete. From the outside, it looked strange. A low mound of earth and grass with a stone chimney rising from the center. Windows small and deeply recessed into walls that seemed far too thick. A door solid enough to withstand a battering ram, hung on iron hinges that Klaus Brenner had made stronger than any fortress gate. Inside, the house was larger than it appeared. The main room stretched 30 feet in one direction and 20 in the other. The ceiling was high enough for a tall man to stand with room to spare. The fireplace was built from the same limestone as the foundation, large enough to burn logs 4 feet long, designed to radiate heat in all directions, rather than sending it straight up the chimney. Off the main room lay smaller chambers, a root cellar carved into the bedrock, where Stellan had stored potatoes, turnips, dried beans, and barrels of salted meat. A sleeping alcove built into the warmest corner, where the heat from the fireplace accumulated and lingered through the night. A workshop with space for tools and repairs during the long months when outside work was impossible. But the most important feature could not be seen at all. The stone basin in the corner of the main room was connected to a system of drainage channels that ran beneath the floor. During autumn rains, water from the surrounding land flowed into these channels, was filtered through gravel, and collected in the basin. 400 gallons of drinking water, stored underground where it would not freeze, available all winter without the need to melt snow or chip ice from frozen streams. Stellan had also prepared fuel. 6 cords of firewood were stacked in a lean-to shed attached to the north side of the house, protected from wind and snow, dry and ready for burning. At normal consumption, 6 cords would last 3 winters. At emergency consumption, when the fire burned constantly to fight extreme cold, 6 cords would last 1 winter with wood to spare. The neighbors did not know about any of this. They saw only the strange mound with its thick walls and small windows. They saw a man who had wasted an entire growing season building something that would surely collapse at the first serious storm. Then November came, and Stellan did something that made even his few supporters question his sanity. He began shoveling snow against the sides of his house, not clearing it away, as any sensible person would do, piling it higher, creating banks of white that climbed the walls until the lower windows were nearly buried. From a distance, the structure looked less like a house and more like a snow-covered burial mound. Harlan Whitmore rode past on the third day of this strange activity. He stopped his horse and stared at the Norwegian, who was methodically packing snow against the eastern wall with the same careful attention he had given to every other aspect of construction. "Now he's burying himself alive," Harlan called out, laughing so hard he nearly fell from his saddle. "The man builds a fortress and then covers it in the very thing he's trying to keep out. I've seen madness before, but this beats everything." Stellan stopped working long enough to look at the rancher. "Snow is not cold," he said. "Snow keeps cold away." Harlan laughed even harder. "Snow is frozen water, you fool. It's the definition of cold." "Snow traps air," Stellan replied patiently. "Air does not move. Air that does not move does not steal heat. The snow becomes a blanket, not a threat." "A blanket?" Harlan shook his head in disbelief. "You're using snow as a blanket. In Norway, we have done this for 1,000 years. The snow protects. The cold cannot reach what the snow covers." Harlan rode away still laughing, and by evening the story had spread throughout the valley. The Norwegian had finally lost his mind completely. He was burying his own house in snow. The winter would kill him for certain now. But old Ezekiel Thorne heard the story and did not laugh. He remembered something his grandfather had told him, decades ago, about trappers who survived impossible winters by digging caves in snowbanks. He remembered that the inside of those caves stayed warm enough to melt ice, even when the air outside was cold enough to freeze a man solid in minutes. "The Norwegian knows something," Ezekiel muttered to himself. "Something the rest of us forgot." The first real test came later that same month. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero for 4 consecutive nights. Wind howled across the prairie at 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally through the darkness. The settlers huddled in their cabins, feeding their fires constantly, watching their wood piles shrink faster than they had expected. In Stellan's house, the fire burned low, not because there was no wood, not because Stellan was conserving fuel. The fire burned low because the house did not need more heat. The thick walls absorbed what the fireplace produced and released it slowly back into the room. The deep foundation drew warmth from the earth itself, where the temperature stayed constant at 54 degrees, regardless of what happened above. The snow that had piled against the outside walls acted as additional insulation, trapping air and preventing wind from reaching the structure beneath. Inside, the temperature never dropped below 56 degrees. Linnea came to visit on the third day of the cold snap, wrapped in furs and shivering despite them. When she stepped through the heavy door and into the main room, she stopped suddenly, her eyes widening with surprise. "It's warm," she breathed. "It's actually warm." Stellan was sitting at a table he had built from pine boards, reading a book by the light of the fireplace. Odin lay at his feet, his tail thumping against the floor at Linnea's arrival. "It's warmer than our house," Linnea continued, unwrapping her furs. "And Father burns 3 times as much wood as you do." "Your father's house loses heat through the roof," Stellan said. "Through the walls, through the floor. The fire burns and burns, but most of the warmth escapes before it can do any good." "And yours doesn't?" "Mine has nowhere to go. The heat stays because I built walls that hold it. The cold stays out because I built foundations that reach below the frozen ground." He smiled slightly. "It is not complicated. It is just careful." Linnea sat down across from him, her cheeks still flushed from the cold outside. "My father noticed. He hasn't said anything, but I saw him watching your chimney this morning, watching how little smoke comes out compared to ours. He will not admit he was wrong." "No," she agreed. "He never admits he's wrong, but he's thinking about it. I can tell." She reached across the table and took his hand in hers. Her fingers were cold from the ride, but they warmed quickly in his grasp. "You built something that works," she said. "Something real, and eventually everyone will have to acknowledge it, even my father. Stellan looked at her, at the firelight dancing in her eyes, at the certainty in her expression, and he felt something shift inside him. The grief was still there. The memory of Astrid dying in his arms would never fade completely. But alongside that grief, something new was growing, something that felt almost like hope. "Will you come again?" he asked. "Every day," she said, "until you stop looking surprised when I walk through the door." She smiled, and he found himself smiling back. And in that moment, the cold outside seemed very far away. But the cold snap in November was only a rehearsal. The real performance was still waiting in the wings. Old Ezekiel Thorne felt it first. He had lived through enough Montana winters to read the signs that others missed. The way the clouds moved, the color of the sunset, the behavior of animals preparing for something worse than normal. He came to Stellan's house on the 10th of December, walking slowly with his elk antler cane, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Something's coming," he said when Stellan opened the door. "Something bad. Worse than 56. Worse than anything I've seen." Stellan invited him inside, gave him hot coffee, listened carefully to everything the old man had to say. "The signs are all wrong," Ezekiel continued, warming his hands around the cup. "The geese flew south 6 weeks early. The elk have moved to lower ground. The sky has a color I've only seen once before, and that time we lost 40 people in this valley alone. When will it come? A month? Maybe less. Maybe more." The old man shook his head slowly. "But it's coming. I can feel it in my bones. And when it arrives, it won't show any mercy." Stellan nodded. "I am ready. I know you are." Ezekiel looked around the warm room, at the thick walls, at the fireplace radiating steady heat, at the supplies carefully stored and organized. "That's why I came to you first, because you're the only one in this valley who might survive what's coming. The others could survive too, if they prepared. They won't. They'll do what they always do. They'll assume winter will be like every other winter. They'll burn through their wood too fast. They'll run out of food. They'll freeze in houses that were never built to protect them." The old man's eyes were sad. "I've seen it before. Too many times." "Then we must warn them." Ezekiel laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You think they'll listen to you? The man they've been mocking since April? The fool who dug his own grave?" "They will not listen to me," Stellan agreed, "but they might listen to you." The old man was silent for a long moment. Then he finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully. "I'll try," he said, "for whatever good it will do. But promise me something." "What?" "When they come to you for help, and they will come, don't turn them away. Don't let them freeze just because they laughed at you." Ezekiel stood slowly, leaning on his cane. "Be better than they were. That's the only real victory." Stellan walked him to the door. "I will not turn them away." "Good." The old man stepped out into the cold. "Because when this winter ends, you're going to be the most important man in this valley, whether you want to be or not." He walked away into the December gray, and Stellan watched him go, knowing that everything was about to change. If you are watching this and you know that something difficult is coming, if you can feel it in your bones the way Ezekiel felt that winter approaching, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you are preparing for and how you are building your own walls against the storm. The storm began on the 12th of January, 1879. It did not announce itself with thunder or lightning. It came quietly, almost gently, with clouds that rolled in from the northwest and spread across the sky like a gray blanket being pulled over the world. The air grew still. The birds stopped singing. The animals disappeared into their burrows and dens. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky had turned a color that made the old-timers stop and stare. Not gray, not white. A pale, sickly green that seemed to drain the life from everything it touched. A color that meant only one thing. Death was coming. The snow began falling at 4 o'clock. Light at first. Delicate flakes drifting down like feathers from a torn pillow. Within an hour, the flakes had grown larger and heavier. Within 2 hours, they were falling so thick and fast that visibility dropped to 30 feet. Within 3 hours, the wind arrived. It came from the north with a sound like 1,000 trains approaching at once. A roar so deep and constant that it became almost impossible to hear anything else. The temperature which had been near zero when the snow began, plunged downward with terrifying speed. 10 below, 20 below, 30 below. By midnight of that first night, the temperature had reached 42 degrees below zero. The wind drove the snow horizontally across the prairie. It piled against every obstacle, burying fences and sheds and animals too slow to reach shelter. It found every crack in every wall, every gap in every door, every weakness in every structure, built by men who had never imagined cold like this. In Harlan Whitmore's house, the fire burned fiercely all night. Dorothea fed log after log into the fireplace, watching the flames leap and dance, feeling the heat against her face while her back remained cold. The wind pressed against the walls, seeking entry, and it found what it was looking for in a dozen places where the chinking had shrunk or cracked. By morning, frost had formed on the inside of the windows. By noon, the frost was half an inch thick. By evening, the temperature inside the house had dropped below freezing, despite the fire that never stopped burning. Harlan paced in front of the fireplace, his face grim. He had survived 20 winters in this valley. He had seen cold that killed cattle and snow that buried houses. But he had never seen anything like this. The storm was relentless. The cold was merciless. And his woodpile, which had seemed so large in October, was shrinking faster than he had ever imagined possible. "We're burning too fast," Dorothea said quietly, watching another log disappear into the flames. "At this rate, we'll run out before the weekends." "We won't run out," Harlan replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "The storm will break. It has to break." But the storm did not break. The first day became the second, and the second became the third. The temperature never rose above 35 below zero. The wind never stopped howling. The snow never stopped falling, and the wood piles across the valley never stopped shrinking. On the fourth day of the storm, the first death came. Old Miller was his name, a bachelor who lived alone on a small claim 3 miles from town. He had been 71 years old, stubborn and independent, determined to prove he could survive one more winter without help from anyone. His body was found 2 weeks later, when the snow finally melted enough for searchers to reach his cabin. He had frozen to death sitting in his chair, facing a cold fireplace, wrapped in every blanket he owned. The woodpile beside his house was empty. The last log had burned 3 days before he died, and he had been too weak or too frozen to walk the half-mile to his neighbor's property for help. The searchers found his journal beside his body. The last entry read, "So cold. Can't feel my hands. Fire is out. Should have listened to the old man. Should have built deeper. Too late now." Nobody laughed when they read those words, but by then, other houses had already begun to fail. Luther Crenshaw's roof started sagging on the third day of the storm. The weight of the snow, combined with the moisture that had accumulated in the rafters over years of poor maintenance, was more than the structure could bear. Margaret heard the first crack while she was cooking dinner, a sound like a gunshot echoing through the house. Then another crack, then a groan that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They evacuated to the main room just before the kitchen ceiling collapsed. A beam came down across the table where Margaret had been standing moments earlier. If she had hesitated, if she had stopped to grab something she thought was important, she would have been crushed. Instead, she was only injured. Her arm broke when a section of the ceiling struck her as she fled. The bone snapped cleanly below the elbow, and she screamed with a sound that Luther would hear in his nightmares for years afterward. He carried her to the fireplace and set the bone himself, using boards from a chair and strips torn from a tablecloth. Then he piled every blanket they owned around her and tried to figure out what to do next. Half their house was now open to the storm. Snow was pouring in through the collapsed section. The temperature in the remaining room was dropping by the minute, and their woodpile, which had been stacked in the kitchen, was now buried under debris that would take hours to clear. Luther did not know it yet, but his family was slowly dying. In Stellan's house, the fire burned low. Not because fuel was scarce, not because the storm had found ways through the thick walls. The fire burned low because the house did not need it to burn high. The temperature inside remained steady at 58 degrees, exactly where it had been since the storm began. Stellan sat at his table, eating a bowl of stew made from potatoes and salted pork stored in his root cellar. Odin lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head when a particularly strong gust of wind made the walls creak slightly. But the creaks were not sounds of distress. They were sounds of resistance. The house was built to move with the storm rather than against it, to flex without breaking, to hold without shattering. Linnea had arrived on the second day of the storm, before the roads became completely impassable. She had told her father she was going to check on a neighbor, but Harlan knew where she was really going. He had not forbidden it. Perhaps he no longer had the heart to forbid anything related to the Norwegian. Now she sat across from Stellan, wrapped in a blanket, though she did not really need it, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "How long can it last?" she asked. "I do not know. The longest storm I saw in Norway lasted 9 days. But the cold was not this deep, and the wind was not this strong. My father's house was already struggling yesterday. The wind is getting through the walls. The fire can't keep up." Stellan nodded slowly. "I know. He won't come here. You know that. He's too proud." "I know that too." Linnea was silent for a moment. Then she looked at him with eyes that held fear and love in equal measure. "But he will have to come eventually, when the wood runs out, when the cold becomes too much. He will have no choice." "And when he comes," Stellan said quietly, "I will open the door. Even after everything he said about you, everything he did." Stellan reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle. "I watched my sister die because our house was not strong enough," he said. "I will not watch anyone else die for the same reason. Not your father, not anyone. The house I built is not just for me, it is for whoever needs it." Linnea's eyes filled with tears. She did not cry for herself or for her father or even for the storm raging outside. She cried for the man sitting across from her, the man who had transformed grief into purpose and pain into protection. "I love you," she whispered. It was the first time either of them had said those words. They hung in the air between them, fragile and powerful, as real as the stone walls that surrounded them. Stellan squeezed her hand. "I know," he said. "I have known for months. I was just waiting until it was safe to say it back." "Is it safe now?" He smiled, and the expression transformed his face from something stern and guarded into something warm and open and almost young. "Nothing is safe in a world with winters like this," he said, "but love is worth the risk. It always has been." He rose from the table and walked to her side. Then he knelt beside her chair and looked up at her face, at the tears still wet on her cheeks, at the firelight reflected in her eyes. "I love you, Linnea Whitmore, and when this storm ends, I will ask your father for permission to marry you. And if he refuses, I will ask again, and again, until he understands that some things are stronger than stubbornness." She laughed through her tears and wrapped her arms around his neck. Odin raised his head and watched them with what looked remarkably like approval. Outside, the wind screamed across the prairie. Inside, two people held each other and waited for the world to decide their fate. The storm raged for 4 more days. On the 5th day, the temperature dropped to 47 degrees below zero. On the 6th day, it dropped further to 51 below. On the 7th day, it reached 52 degrees below zero, the coldest temperature ever recorded in Montana territory. At 52 below, the world became a hostile alien landscape. Exposed skin could freeze in less than 3 minutes. Metal became so cold that touching it could strip the flesh from a hand. Breath froze the moment it left the mouth, forming tiny crystals that fell to the ground like snow. People stopped going outside. They huddled around their fires and watched their woodpiles shrink and prayed for the storm to end. But the storm did not end. It continued day after day, night after night, as if it had decided to punish the valley for some crime no one could name. On the morning of the 8th day, Harlan Whitmore's fire went out. He had burned the last log 3 hours earlier. He had burned chairs. He had burned the wooden frame of a painting his wife had brought from Ohio. He had burned the kitchen table, the only piece of furniture they had left. And now there was nothing left to burn. The temperature inside the house dropped rapidly. It had been barely above freezing, even with the fire. Without it, the cold rushed in like water filling a sinking ship. Within an hour, Dorothea could see her breath. Within 2 hours, frost began forming on the walls. Eliza, their youngest daughter, was the first to show serious symptoms. She was 8 years old, small and thin, and she did not have the body mass to generate enough heat to keep herself warm. She stopped talking first. Then she stopped moving. Then she simply sat beside the dead fireplace, wrapped in blankets, her lips turning blue, her eyes growing distant. "Thomas," Dorothea said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas, she's dying." Harlan knelt beside his daughter and felt her forehead. It was cold. Too cold. The kind of cold that meant the body was giving up its fight against the winter. "She needs warmth," Dorothea continued. "Real warmth. Not blankets. A fire. Heat. We don't have any wood left. Then we have to go somewhere that does." Harlan closed his eyes. He knew what his wife was asking. He knew where she was asking him to go. The only house in the valley that would still be warm. The only house that had been built to survive something like this. The house of the man he had called a fool. The man he had mocked and ridiculed and dismissed as a crazy immigrant who did not understand the frontier. The man whose construction methods he had laughed at in front of the entire town. "Thomas!" Dorothea's voice was desperate now. "She will die. Our daughter will die. Is your pride worth more than her life?" The question struck him like a physical blow. He looked at his wife's face, at the terror in her eyes, at the love and fear and anger all mixed together. Then he looked at Eliza, at her small body barely visible beneath the pile of blankets, at her lips that had gone from blue to nearly white. "No," he whispered. "No, it's not." He stood up slowly. His joints ached from the cold. His muscles protested the movement. But he forced himself upright and began pulling on every piece of warm clothing he could find. "I'll carry her," he said. "It's 2 miles. I can make it in an hour if the wind doesn't knock me down. I'm coming with you." "No, stay here with the boys. Keep them warm as long as you can. If I don't make it back," he paused. "If I don't make it back, wait for the storm to break and then follow my tracks." Dorothea wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Someone had to stay with their sons. Someone had to keep them from following their father into the storm. Harlan wrapped Eliza in every blanket they had left. Then he lifted her in his arms and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch, looking back at his wife one last time. "I was wrong about him," he said. "About everything. I should have listened. I should have learned. Instead, I laughed, and now my daughter is dying because of it." "She's not dead yet," Dorothea replied. "Go. Save her. You can apologize later." He nodded once. Then he opened the door and stepped into the white death that had swallowed the world. The 2 miles to Stellan's house took nearly 3 hours. The wind fought him every step. It drove snow into his face until he could barely see. It pushed against his body until he had to lean forward at a 45-degree angle just to stay upright. It found every gap in his clothing and filled those gaps with cold that burned like fire. Harlan fell 7 times. Each time he forced himself back to his feet. Each time he shifted Eliza's weight in his arms and continued walking. The cold had frozen his face into a mask. His fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. His feet felt like blocks of wood. But he did not stop. He could not stop. Because every time he thought about stopping, he felt the small body in his arms, still breathing, still fighting, still alive. He almost missed the house. It was buried under snow, nothing but a white mound with a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere near the center. If he had been 10 feet further to the left, he would have walked right past it without knowing. But he saw the smoke, and he turned toward it, and somehow he found the door. He had no strength left to knock. He could barely raise his arm, so he simply leaned against the door and pushed, letting his body weight do what his muscles could not. The door swung inward. Warmth hit him like a wave. Real warmth. Deep warmth. The kind of warmth he had not felt in days, maybe weeks. It wrapped around him like an embrace, and for just a moment, he thought he might be dead. He thought this might be heaven. Then he saw Stellan Varger standing in front of the fireplace, and he knew he was very much alive. "Help her," Harlan whispered. "Please, help my daughter." He held out the bundle in his arms. The blankets had frozen solid around Eliza's body. Ice crystals covered her face. Her lips were white. Her skin was the color of old snow. Stellan did not hesitate. He stepped forward and took the child from Harlan's arms. He carried her to the fireplace and began removing the frozen blankets, his hands working quickly and surely. Linnea was beside him in an instant, bringing warm water and clean cloth and the supplies they would need. Harlan stood in the doorway, swaying on his feet, watching the Norwegian work to save his daughter's life. The man he had called a fool. The man he had mocked for building something no one understood. "Close the door," Stellan said without looking up. "You're letting the cold in." Harlan obeyed. Then his legs gave way, and he collapsed to the floor, and he did not move again for a very long time. Have you ever had to ask for help from someone you wronged? Have you ever had to swallow your pride and admit that you were the one who was foolish? Tell me in the comments about a time when you had to humble yourself and what it taught you about who you really are. Eliza Whitmore did not open her eyes for 6 hours. She lay beside the fireplace, wrapped in blankets that Stellan had warmed by the flames. Her small body was still, her breathing was shallow, but her lips had regained some color, and her skin had lost the deathly white that had terrified her father. Harlan sat against the wall nearby, unable to move, watching every rise and fall of his daughter's chest. His hands had thawed enough to hurt, and the pain was almost unbearable. Sharp needles of fire radiated from his fingers to his wrists to his elbows, but he did not complain. He did not ask for help with his own suffering. He simply watched his daughter and waited. Stellan moved quietly through the house, checking supplies, adding wood to the fire, heating water for tea. Linnea stayed beside Eliza, monitoring her breathing, adjusting blankets, speaking to her in soft tones that might or might not be heard. Odin lay at the foot of Eliza's makeshift bed, his muzzle resting on his paws, his eyes never leaving her face. He seemed to understand that this child needed watching. He seemed to have decided that watching was his job. At some point during those long hours, someone knocked at the door. Stellan opened it to find Luther and Margaret Crenshaw standing in the snow. Luther was carrying his wife, who was conscious but clearly in pain. Her arm was wrapped in bloody cloth, and her face was pale with shock. "Our roof collapsed," Luther said. His voice was flat, empty of pride or pretense. "We have nowhere else to go." Stellan stepped aside. "Come in, quickly. The cold follows you." They came in and Stellan closed the door, and the house absorbed 2 more people without complaint. Margaret was settled near the fire, and Stellan examined her arm with careful hands. The bone had been set correctly, but the splint was crude and the bandages needed changing. He cleaned the wound and applied fresh wrappings and gave her willow bark tea for the pain. Through it all, Luther Crenshaw sat in silence, his eyes moving around the room, taking in details he had dismissed during his earlier visits. The thick walls, the steady warmth, the supplies stacked neatly in corners. The system that had been mocked and criticized but was now providing the only shelter available in a storm that had destroyed everything else. More knocks came as the night wore on. Colton Briggs arrived next, half dead from cold, his face frost-bitten, his feet so frozen he could barely walk. He had been trying to find his lost cattle when the worst of the storm hit, and he had wandered for hours before finding Stellan's house almost by accident. Reverend Josiah Tate came with 3 members of his congregation, whose own homes had failed. The church roof had collapsed under the weight of snow, destroying the building that had stood for 12 years. The minister no longer spoke of God, humbling the proud. He simply asked for shelter and received it without question. Klaus Brenner brought 2 neighboring families, including 4 children and an elderly grandmother who could barely walk. He had spent the previous day helping people evacuate failing houses, and Stellan's home was the last refuge he had not yet tried. And on the morning of the 10th day, when most people had given up hope that anyone else could survive the journey, Ephraim Kessler appeared at the door. The banker who had planned to buy Stellan's land for pennies was barely recognizable. His expensive coat was torn. His face was frost-bitten in patches of white and angry red. His horses had died on the road, and he had walked the last 3 miles through snow that reached his chest. "My office collapsed," he said, his voice a broken whisper. 12 horses dead in the stable. Everything I built, gone. Stellan opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "There is room." Kessler stumbled inside and collapsed near the fire. He did not speak again for 2 days. When he finally did, it was only to say 4 words. "I was a fool." By midnight of that 10th day, 19 people were crowded into the house Stellan Varger had built. 19 people who had watched him dig that hole in the ground. 19 people who had heard the jokes about the fool digging his own grave. 19 people who had laughed or gossiped or shaken their heads at the immigrant who did not understand how things were done in Montana. Now they huddled around his fireplace, eating food from his root cellar, drinking water from his storage basin, breathing air that stayed warm because of walls they had called too thick and foundations they had called too deep. And the storm continued to rage outside, indifferent to their survival, but unable to reach them. Eliza woke just before dawn on the 11th day. Her eyes opened slowly, and for a moment she seemed confused by her surroundings. The unfamiliar room, the crowd of people, the warmth that was so different from the cold that was the last thing she remembered. Then she saw the dog lying at her feet. "Doggy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Odin's tail began to wag. He lifted his head and looked at her with eyes that held nothing but gentle affection. Then he crawled forward slowly, carefully, and laid his head against her side. Eliza's small hand reached out and rested on his fur. "Soft," she said. "Warm." These were the first words she had spoken in nearly 24 hours. Such simple words, such ordinary words. But Harlan Whitmore, watching from across the room, felt tears streaming down his face when he heard them. His daughter was alive. His daughter would survive. The nightmare was ending. He tried to stand, but his legs would not support him. So he crawled instead, crossing the room on hands and knees until he reached the place where Eliza lay. Then he gathered her in his arms and held her against his chest and wept like a child. "I'm sorry," he said, though she could not understand what he was apologizing for. "I'm so sorry. I should have built better. I should have listened. I should have been a better father." Eliza patted his cheek with one small hand. "Daddy crying?" "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy is crying, but they're happy tears. Happy because you're alive." "The doggy helped me," Eliza said seriously. "He kept me warm." Harlan looked at Odin, who was still pressed against Eliza's side, still wagging his tail, still watching her with devoted attention. "Yes," Harlan agreed. "He did. He's a very good dog. Can we keep him?" Despite everything, despite the storm and the cold and the terror of the past days, Harlan laughed. It was a broken sound, torn from a chest that was too exhausted for proper laughter. But it was real. "We'll have to ask Mr. Varga about that," he said. "It's his dog." Stellan had been standing nearby, watching the reunion without intruding. Now he knelt down beside the father and daughter and spoke quietly. "Odin belonged to my sister," he said. "She died when she was not much older than your daughter. I have carried him with me ever since, because he was all I had left of her." He paused, and his gray eyes grew distant with memory. "But I think Astrid would have wanted him to be happy, and he looks happy right now." Eliza had fallen asleep again, her hand still resting on Odin's fur, her breathing deep and regular. The dog had not moved from her side. "He can visit," Stellan said finally, "when you rebuild, when the storm ends. He can visit whenever she wants. He likes children. He always has." Harlan looked at the Norwegian for a long moment, at the face he had mocked, at the hands that had dug a hole the whole valley had laughed at the man who had opened his door at 2 in the morning and saved his daughter's life without asking for anything in return. "I was wrong," Harlan said. His voice was rough, but the words were clear. "I was wrong about everything. I called you a fool while you were building the only thing that could save us. I laughed at you in front of the whole town. And when my daughter was dying, the only place that could save her was the house I mocked." He bowed his head. "I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway, because you deserve to hear it, even if you don't forgive me." Stellan was silent for a moment. Then he reached out and placed his hand on Harlan's shoulder. "In Norway," he said quietly, "we have a saying. The ice does not care who was right. The cold does not remember who was wise. The only thing that matters is who survives and what they learn from surviving." He squeezed Harlan's shoulder gently. "You survived. Your daughter survived. Now you can learn. That is enough." The storm broke on the morning of the 12th day. The wind died first, dropping from a howl to a whisper to absolute silence. Then the clouds began to thin, and sunlight appeared for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The temperature rose from 52 below zero to merely 20 below, and the change felt almost warm by comparison. The 19 people in Stellan's house emerged slowly, blinking in the sudden brightness, staring at a world that had been completely transformed. The snow lay 6 feet deep across the valley floor, with drifts reaching 20 feet against some buildings. Fences had vanished. Sheds had collapsed. The landscape looked like a white ocean frozen in the middle of a storm, but the house behind them still stood, low and solid and warm, unchanged by the fury that had destroyed so much else. The work of recovery began immediately. Over the following days, the survivors spread out across the valley, digging through snow to find what remained of their homes and possessions. The news was grim. 7 people had died during the storm, including old Miller and 2 families who had lived on isolated claims. Dozens of buildings had collapsed. Hundreds of animals had frozen to death. The damage would take years to repair, but the survivors had something new that they had not possessed before the storm. They had knowledge. If you are watching this and you have ever been proven right after everyone doubted you, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you built or created or believed in when the whole world said you were wrong. Tell me how it felt when they finally understood. Luther Crenshaw became the first convert. He returned to Stellan's house 3 days after the storm ended, carrying a notebook and a measuring stick, and asked if he could study the construction in detail. Stellan agreed, and for the next week, the carpenter, who had dismissed the Norwegians' methods, walked through every room, measured every wall, examined every joint and bracket and beam. "I've been building wrong," Luther admitted when the study was complete. "For 20 years, everything I thought I knew was barely half the truth." "You knew what worked most of the time," Stellan replied. "I built for the time when most was not enough. Can you teach me?" "Yes, anyone who wants to learn." The lessons began that same week. Stellan explained the principles his mother had taught him, the principles his grandfather had passed down, the principles that had kept people alive in Norwegian mountains for generations. Deep foundations that reached below the frost line, thick walls that trapped heat inside, roofs that carried their weight to the ground rather than to the walls, drainage systems that prevented water accumulation, storage systems that ensured survival through the longest winters. He drew diagrams on paper. He demonstrated techniques in the field. He answered questions with patience and clarity, never condescending, never reminding anyone of the mockery they had once offered him. Colton Briggs, the young man who had bet $20 that Stellan would fail, became one of his most dedicated students. The frostbite had cost him 2 toes on his left foot, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But he learned everything Stellan would teach him, and within a year, he had built a house for himself that incorporated every principle he had absorbed. Reverend Josiah Tate delivered a sermon the following Sunday that acknowledged a different kind of wisdom than he had preached before. He spoke of preparation and humility, and the arrogance of assuming that tomorrow would be like today. He did not mention Stellan by name, but everyone in the congregation knew who he was talking about. Margaret Crenshaw, whose arm had healed cleanly, became one of Stellan's most vocal advocates. She who had pitied the poor immigrant now told everyone she met about the house that had saved 19 lives, about the man who had built it, about the knowledge he was willing to share with anyone who asked. And Harlan Whitmore paid for the materials that built 14 new houses in the valley that spring and summer, every one of them following Stellan's design. In July of 1879, 6 months after the storm, Stellan Varger married Linnea Whitmore. The ceremony was held in the yard beside the house he had built, with the Bitterroot Mountains visible in the distance and the summer sun warming faces that still remembered what real cold felt like. Old Ezekiel Thorne stood as witness. Klaus Brenner served as best man. Odin lay beside the makeshift altar, watching the proceedings with the quiet dignity of a dog who had seen many things and was prepared to see many more. Harlan Whitmore stood beside his daughter as she spoke her vows. His face held none of the arrogance that had marked it a year earlier. The storm had changed him, as it had changed everyone. He had learned that pride was a poor foundation for survival, and that wisdom could come from places he had never thought to look. When the ceremony ended and Stellan kissed his bride, a cheer rose from the assembled crowd. These were the same people who had laughed at the Norwegian digging his hole, the same people who had bet on his failure, the same people who had called him a fool for building something no one understood. Now they cheered for him because they finally understood. 15 years passed. Stellan and Linnea raised 4 children in the house he had built, 3 sons and a daughter, all of them learning from their earliest years the principles that had saved their parents' lives. They grew up knowing how to read the sky for weather signs. They grew up knowing how to build walls that held heat and foundations that did not shift. They grew up with the quiet confidence that came from understanding how to survive in a world that could turn hostile without warning. Odin lived until 1893, passing away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 19. It was an extraordinary lifespan for a dog, as if he had simply refused to leave until he was certain his work was done, until he knew that the family he had protected was safe. Stellan buried him in a spot overlooking the valley, and he carved a marker from granite that read, "He kept watch when no one else believed." Colton Briggs, the young man who had once bet on Stellan's failure, became a builder himself. He constructed houses throughout Montana Territory and into the neighboring regions, all of them following the principles he had learned. By the turn of the century, more than 200 structures bore his influence, and all of them were built deep and built strong. Luther Crenshaw retired from carpentry at age 60, but he wrote a manual on construction techniques that was published by a printing house in St. Louis. He credited Stellan Varger in the introduction, calling him the wisest builder I have ever known and the most patient teacher any man could ask for. Harlan Whitmore died in 1891 at the age of 65. His final years were marked by a humility that surprised everyone who had known him before the storm. He had stopped boasting about his past accomplishments. He had stopped dismissing the wisdom of others. He had learned, as some men learn, that pride was a weakness disguised as strength. At his funeral, Stellan stood beside Linnea and held her hand while she wept for the father she had loved despite his flaws. And when the service ended, Stellan spoke words that surprised everyone who heard them. "He was a difficult man," Stellan said, "but he became a better man. The storm that nearly destroyed his family also made him stronger. And he spent his last years proving that people can change, even when change seems impossible." He paused, looking at the grave. "I was angry at him once, for the things he said, for the way he mocked what I was building. But anger is like holding a burning coal. It hurts you more than anyone else. So I let it go. And when I let it go, I discovered that forgiveness was its own kind of strength." 34 years after arriving in Montana Territory, Stellan Varger died in his sleep. It was January of 1912, and a winter storm was blowing outside when he passed. Not as fierce as the storm of 1879, but cold enough and strong enough to remind everyone who lived through it that Montana had not forgotten how to be dangerous. Stellan was 67 years old. His hair had turned white. His hands had grown stiff with age, but his eyes had never lost their clarity, and his mind had never lost its sharpness. He had spent his final years teaching his grandchildren the same lessons he had taught their parents, ensuring that the knowledge would pass to another generation. His final words were spoken to his eldest grandson, a boy of 12 who had the same gray eyes as his grandfather. "People laugh when they don't understand," Stellan said. "Don't be angry at them. Build and let the building speak. The truth always wins in the end. It just takes patience." He closed his eyes and did not open them again. Linnea lived another 8 years, passing away in 1920 at the age of 61. She was buried beside her husband in a cemetery that looked out over the valley where they had built their life together. Their children continued living in the house Stellan had built, and their grandchildren after them, and their great-grandchildren after that. In 1978, nearly a century after the storm that had tested Stellan's construction, researchers from Montana State University came to the Bitterroot Valley to study surviving structures from the homesteading era. They were particularly interested in the Varger house. It was still standing. The original foundation had never cracked. The walls had never shifted. The roof, replaced twice over the decades, still rested on the same posts that Stellan had sunk into the bedrock more than 100 years earlier. The researchers measured everything. They tested insulation values. They compared temperature readings inside and outside. They analyzed the construction techniques and compared them to modern building standards. Their conclusion was published in a Journal of Architectural Engineering the following year. The Varger house, they wrote, demonstrated thermal efficiency 2.3 times greater than typical construction of its era. The principles employed in its design anticipated passive house architecture by more than a century. The builder, working without formal training or modern materials, had created a structure that professional engineers would be proud to claim today. They also found something else. Carved into the stone foundation, Hidden in a corner where no one would see it unless they were looking, were words in Norwegian. The researchers had them translated. They read, "For Astrid. So no one else has to die." The house still stands today. It belongs to a family named Larson, direct descendants of Stellan and Linnea Varger through their daughter. They have modernized certain systems over the years, adding electricity and plumbing and other conveniences that did not exist in 1878. But the core structure remains unchanged. The deep foundation, the thick walls, the roof that carries its weight to the bedrock. The Montana Historical Society placed a marker beside the house in 1985, commemorating its significance as one of the oldest continuously occupied structures in the state. The marker tells a brief version of the story, mentioning the storm of 1879 and the lives that were saved. But it does not mention the laughter. It does not mention how the neighbors mocked a man digging a hole in the ground. It does not mention the bets placed on his failure or the condescension offered by people who thought they knew better. It does not mention how Harlan Whitmore called him a fool, or how that same Harlan Whitmore carried his dying daughter through a blizzard to beg for shelter. Some parts of history are too complicated for markers and plaques. On the frontier, there was one truth that never changed. You cannot argue with winter. You cannot bargain with the cold. You cannot convince a blizzard to show mercy or persuade ice to spare your family. The only thing you can do is prepare. Build deep. Build strong. Build with patience and knowledge, and the understanding that survival is not a game won by the fastest, but by the wisest. Stellan Varger understood this truth because he had learned it the hardest way possible. He had held his sister while she died. He had watched his father crushed by a collapsing house. He had carried grief across an ocean and turned it into something useful. The laughter stopped when the snow fell, but the house still stands. And in that house, generation after generation has lived and loved and raised their children in warmth, protected by walls built by a man who refused to take shortcuts, who refused to compromise, who refused to forget the promise he had made to a dying girl in a small village in Norway. Build deep, build strong. Never let the earth take another person you love. He kept that promise. He kept it for the rest of his life, and the house he built keeps it still. Thank you for listening to this story. If it reminded you that preparation matters more than popularity, if it showed you that patience and wisdom are stronger than speed and arrogance, I would like to hear from you. Tell me in the comments about someone in your life who was mocked for being different, for doing things their own way, for refusing to follow the crowd.